In this podcast episode, Colonel Richard Kemp, a former head of British forces in Afghanistan and a seasoned military strategist, shares his perspectives on the complex geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, particularly focusing on the ongoing conflicts involving Israel, Iran, and various proxy groups. Kemp begins by expressing his belief that President Biden's actions regarding Israel warrant serious scrutiny, suggesting that they could be seen as treacherous. He argues that Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was not only a catastrophic decision for the U.S. and its allies, but also emboldened adversaries like Putin and Iran. This withdrawal, according to Kemp, signaled a lack of resolve that has had far-reaching consequences, including the current conflict in Ukraine. He emphasizes that Biden's approach to Israel has been inconsistent, oscillating between support and pressure, which he believes undermines Israel's ability to effectively combat threats from Hamas and Hezbollah. Kemp's assertion that Biden should be court-martialed, while hyperbolic, underscores his frustration with what he perceives as a failure to uphold commitments to allies. He argues that the U.S. has historically been a staunch supporter of Israel, and any deviation from that support could have dire implications not just for Israel, but for U.S. interests in the region. The conversation shifts to the fundamental nature of the conflict between Israel and its adversaries, particularly Hamas and Hezbollah. Kemp argues that this conflict is not merely about land or occupation, but is deeply rooted in religious ideology. He explains that Hamas and Hezbollah are driven by a desire to eliminate the state of Israel, viewing it as an illegitimate entity that must be destroyed. This ideological battle complicates any potential for peace, as it transcends territorial disputes and taps into a broader narrative of religious supremacy. Kemp emphasizes that the Palestinian leadership, particularly Hamas, does not genuinely seek a two-state solution. Instead, their goal is the complete eradication of Israel. This perspective challenges the common narrative that a negotiated settlement could resolve the conflict. Iran's influence in the region is a central theme in the podcast. Kemp describes Iran as the head of the octopus, with various proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah serving as its arms. He argues that the Iranian regime's ambitions extend beyond regional dominance. They seek to establish Shia supremacy over Sunni Islam and eliminate Western influence, particularly that of the United States and Israel. This ideological framework shapes Iran's support for militant groups and its aggressive posture in the region. Kemp warns that Iran's nuclear ambitions pose a significant threat not only to Israel, but to global stability. He argues that a nuclear-armed Iran would embolden its proxies and deter Western intervention, leading to a more dangerous geopolitical landscape. The colonel advocates for a robust response to Iran's nuclear program, suggesting that military action may be necessary to prevent Iran from achieving its goals. The podcast delves into the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, a topic that has garnered significant international attention. Kemp acknowledges the devastating impact of the conflict on civilians, but argues that Hamas bears responsibility for using civilians as human shields. He explains that Hamas deliberately positions its military infrastructure within civilian areas, knowing that Israeli strikes will result in civilian casualties. This strategy, according to Kemp, is designed to elicit international outrage against Israel and delegitimize its actions. Kemp emphasizes that the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, take extensive measures to minimize civilian casualties, including warning civilians before strikes and aborting missions when civilians are present. He argues that the IDF's efforts to protect civilians are unparalleled in modern warfare. Yet the narrative surrounding the conflict often overlooks these complexities. Kemp discusses the complexities of military engagement in the context of the ongoing conflict. He argues that the IDF's operations in Gaza and Lebanon are not merely about defeating enemy combatants, but also about preventing future attacks. He explains that the goal is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities while minimizing civilian casualties, a challenging task given the densely populated nature of Gaza. Kemp asserts that the IDF's strategy is focused on achieving a sustainable security environment for Israel, which requires a comprehensive approach to military operations. The Colonel also addresses the criticism directed at Israel for its military tactics, arguing that the IDF's actions are often mischaracterized. He contends that the IDF operates under strict rules of engagement designed to protect civilians, and any civilian casualties that occur are a tragic but unavoidable consequence of combat. Looking ahead, Kemp expresses cautious optimism about the potential for stability in Gaza and Lebanon. He argues that if Israel can successfully dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure, there may be an opportunity for a more stable governance structure in Gaza. He suggests that regional powers, such as the UAE, could play a role in stabilizing the area and preventing the resurgence of militant groups. However, he emphasizes that this will require a sustained military presence to ensure that Hamas does not reestablish itself. In Lebanon, Kemp notes that Hezbollah has been significantly weakened by Israeli military operations. He argues that if Israel can continue to apply pressure on Hezbollah, it may lead to a more stable situation in southern Lebanon. However, he cautions that the underlying ideological conflict between Israel and its adversaries will persist, complicating any efforts to achieve lasting peace. The podcast also explores the implications of U.S. politics on the situation in the Middle East. Kemp argues that the upcoming U.S. elections could significantly impact American foreign policy, particularly regarding Israel and Iran. He suggests that a victory for President Biden or Vice President Harris would likely result in a continuation of the current administration's approach, which he views as detrimental to U.S. interests and Israeli security. Conversely, he believes that a Trump presidency could lead to a more robust support for Israel and a firmer stance against Iran. Kemp argues that strong, decisive leadership is essential for addressing the complex challenges facing the region and ensuring that U.S. allies are supported in their efforts to combat terrorism and aggression. Kemp discusses the role of international organizations, particularly the United Nations, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He expresses skepticism about the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping forces, citing their failure to prevent Hezbollah's militarization in southern Lebanon. Kemp argues that the presence of UN forces can sometimes serve as a shield for militant groups, allowing them to operate with impunity while complicating military operations for countries like Israel. Kemp suggests that a reevaluation of the role and effectiveness of these organizations is necessary, particularly in light of their historical failures to address the root causes of conflict. The podcast addresses the issue of radicalization in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Kemp argues that the indoctrination of Palestinian youth has created a generation that harbors deep-seated animosity towards Israel. He points out that many children in Gaza are taught to view Israelis as enemies, and this indoctrination perpetuates the cycle of violence. He emphasizes that addressing the root causes of radicalization is essential for achieving long-term peace in the region.